Is there a
This,
problem, officer?
your truck? The question echoed in the harsh
I'm
white
just
light
getting
of the
gas.
roadside gas station. On what seemed like an unremarkable evening, the man standing next to the pump turned his head. He wasn't startled. He wasn't hurried. He didn't appear defensive. "Evening, officer." "Yes, sir. It's mine." "Just stopping to fill the tank." The police officer stood a few steps away from him, his gaze slowly sweeping along the pickup truck before returning to the man's face. "Nice ride," he said. "Kinda out of place here, though, wouldn't you say?" No smile, no explanation, just a comment hanging in the air. "I'm on my way home from work," the man replied. "I bought this car last year." He continued filling up the gas tank. He didn't turn away. He didn't argue. He didn't show any embarrassment. The police officer stepped closer, hands where I can see them. The man stopped what he was doing, clearly showing both hands to the police officer. "I'm cooperating, officer." There was no reply. The officer stood still for a second, then glanced around the parking lot, as if searching for something that hadn't yet appeared. "Step away from the vehicle." The man complied. Slowly, with control. Around them, everything was proceeding as usual. Another vehicle pulled into the station. Another pump clicked as it shut off. No one thought this would last. But the body camera on the officer's chest was still recording. Officer Patrick Hollis did not state the reason for the contact. He did not introduce himself. He did not say whether the call was prearranged. It was just an order. And the silence continued. The man standing before him was Malcolm R. Hargree, 41 years old, a former U.S. Army serviceman. A man who had served under command for many years and understood well what it meant to remain calm under control. But Patrick Hollis didn't know that, and what he didn't know was that it was in those first few minutes, those seemingly harmless words, those unprovoked commands. This will become the initial evidence for the footage that will cause him to lose his badge permanently. Before the story goes any further, let us know where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because what happens next isn't a typical quiz. Officer Patrick Hollis is no newcomer. He's had enough years in the industry to know the limits of the process, and long enough to know how to stay close to those boundaries without crossing them completely, at least on paper. In Patrick's work record, there's a recurring pattern. Approaches to citizens aren't based on clear violations. Stops are purely observation of the situation. And reports end without citations or arrests, but always leave a lingering sense of unease. For Patrick, the night shift wasn't about reacting, it was about searching. And this roadside gas station, especially late at night, was always the place where he believed something would be revealed. Patrick looked at Malcolm as if waiting for a signal, a glance, an unnecessary movement, an out-of-tune reaction. But Malcolm didn't give him any of that. "I'm just filling up with gas," Malcolm repeated, his voice even, not rising above what was necessary. Patrick didn't answer. He took another half step, closing the distance. No touching, but close enough for the other person to feel the pressure. "Where you coming from?" "Work." "What kind of work?" Malcolm answered briefly. Patrick nodded, but his gaze remained unchanged. "Logistics." At this hour, the question doesn't need an answer. It's an assumption. Patrick glanced around the car, peering through the windows, inspecting the interior with a quick but purposeful look. He saw nothing, but he didn't stop. "You got ID?" "Yes," Malcolm replied. "It's in my wallet." "How can I get it safely?" Patrick didn't confirm. Instead, he raised his hand. "Don't reach for anything." At that moment, the atmosphere changed. It was no longer an exchange. It became a situation of control. Patrick placed his hands near his waist, not drawing a weapon, but enough to emphasize where the power lay. "Step away from the driver's door." Malcolm obeyed. No arguing, no questioning. What Patrick didn't realize, or didn't want to realize, was that this calmness wasn't avoidance. It was discipline. And it is that discipline that is bothering Patrick more than any suspicious behavior. His name was Malcolm R. Hargree, 41 years old, a man accustomed to taking orders, but also well aware of the value of knowing when to keep quiet. He served in the United States Army. Those years are not mentioned on his uniform. There are no insignia, No external markings. They remain only in his upright posture, in the way he maintains his distance, in the way he always keeps his hands in the most visible position. That evening, Malcolm had no intention of staying long. He had just left the distribution center where he worked, finishing a long shift, filled up with gas, got in his car, went home. That's perfectly normal. As Patrick continued to ask questions, Malcolm didn't look away. He didn't try to explain at length, nor did he interrupt. "I'm filling up with gas," he repeated, his voice even. Patrick stepped to the side of the car and peered inside. He found nothing, but his eyes never left Malcolm. "Who owns the vehicle?" "Me," Malcolm replied. "Got proof?" "My ID is in my wallet." "In my jacket pocket." "How do you want me to get it?" That question wasn't meant to delay things. It was a proposal for collaboration. Patrick didn't acknowledge it. He took it a step further. "Don't move." At that moment, Malcolm understood perfectly. This approach was no longer based on behavior, but on the feeling of being in a position of power. Malcolm stood still, shoulders relaxed, breathing slowly. There were no signs of panic. There was no resistance. But Patrick continued. "Why you acting nervous?" "I'm not worried," Malcolm replied. "I'm just answering your question." Patrick shook his head. Confusion's not an excuse. A woman at the pump station next to them stopped what she was doing. She glanced over, then looked down at her phone. She hadn't filmed. She hadn't said anything. She was just observing. Malcolm paid no attention to her. He was completely focused on keeping the situation from escalating. What Patrick didn't realize was that the man in front of him had been in far more stressful situations than this, and had learned not to react, even when pressed. But Patrick wasn't looking for stability. He was looking for a reason. And when no reason came up, he started creating it. Patrick Hollis didn't retreat when he found nothing. On the contrary, he pressed on. "Step back," Patrick said, his voice a beat higher. Toward the rear of the vehicle, Malcolm followed suit. One step. Then he stopped. Patrick stood slightly behind his right shoulder, a familiar position for controlling space, to remind him that just one wrong move could instantly change the situation. "Spread your feet." Malcolm hesitated for a moment. Not in defiance. He was surprised. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," Patrick said, raising his voice so that those around him could hear. Malcolm spread his legs apart, maintaining his balance, his eyes fixed straight ahead. No arguing, no gasping for breath. Patrick began bombarding them with questions, not waiting for the answers to be finished. "Where exactly you coming from?" "Work." "What kind of work runs this late?" "Logistics." "You sure?" Each question is not intended to elicit information. They are meant to create the feeling that the answer is never sufficient. Patrick walked around Malcolm, his eyes scanning from his shoes and trouser legs to his hands clasped behind his back. Nothing unusual, but he didn't stop. "You got anything on you I should know about?" "No." "You sure?" Malcolm nodded. "If you need to know anything, just ask." Patrick didn't answer. He stood back, silent for a few seconds, letting the tension dissipate. At the pump next to them, the woman from earlier had turned completely around. A man in the opposite lane was moving more slowly, clearly listening. Patrick realized that. He spoke louder. "Keep your hands where I can see them." Malcolm remained in the same position. Patrick didn't state why he stopped. He didn't talk about the call. He didn't talk about the violation. Only orders, and a scrutinizing gaze, as if Malcolm's very existence were the issue. At this point, if Patrick had chosen to stop, everything could have ended here. But he didn't do that. He invested too much in his assumptions. And now, withdrawing would be like admitting that he was wrong from the start. Instead of retreating, Patrick chose to push forward. And that's when all eyes in the parking lot started to focus on them. Patrick asked for the papers again, his tone no longer neutral. "ID." "Now." Malcolm nodded slightly. "My wallet is in my jacket pocket. I'll get it slowly." Patrick didn't confirm it. He just nodded, his eyes fixed on Malcolm's hands. Malcolm did exactly as he said he would. Every movement was slow, clear, and precise. He took out his wallet, opened it, and handed it directly to Patrick. Patrick took it and glanced at it quickly. You got any weapons in the vehicle? No. Ever been arrested? Malcolm paused for a moment. Why is that relevant? Patrick didn't answer. Keep your hands where I can see them. The atmosphere was different now. It was no longer the isolated curiosity of a few people around. It was attention. A man in the opposite lane stopped completely at the gas station. A woman near the checkout counter turned to look, and the woman from before Yvette Calderon didn't turn away again. "Officer," she said, keeping her voice calm. "Is there a problem?" Patrick spun around. "Mind your business, ma'am." Yvette took a half step back, but didn't leave. Her eyes betrayed her displeasure. Patrick turned back to Malcolm, his voice louder. "See? This is what happens when you don't just cooperate." "I'm doing exactly as you instructed," Malcolm replied. Patrick ignored him. He continued rummaging through his wallet, as if searching for a new excuse. Somewhere in the background, a phone was raised. No one said anything, but everyone understood what it meant, Patrick realized. He glanced quickly at the screen. "You recording?" Yvette didn't answer. She just held the phone more steadily. Patrick breathed heavily through his nose. Turned back to Malcolm. "You act calm, but you're not being straight with me. I have answered all of your questions. That's not how this works." At that moment, power was no longer invisible. It was being recorded, being observed, being compared between command and reality. Patrick was still unaware that he was being put at a disadvantage. But he sensed one thing very clearly. This approach was no longer entirely within his control. And instead of retreating, he chose to tighten his grip. Patrick raised the radio. For the first time since approaching, "Dispatch, run the plate again. I need a check on the registered owner." He read the license plate slowly and clearly, as if to make sure everything was recorded on the body camera. While waiting for a response, Patrick didn't stand still. He continued speaking not to ask questions, but to shape the narrative. "Out here late," Patrick said, without looking at Malcolm. "Nice car. Acting guarded." "I told him where I came from," Malcolm replied. Patrick que fat lai. "I didn't ask you to talk." Malcolm remained silent. This silence was no longer light. It was heavy, and it spread throughout the parking lot. Those around them no longer pretended not to hear. One person shook their head. Another whispered something to the person next to them. Patrick stood up straight, his shoulders tense. "You see what happens when you don't just do what you're told, en ta noi lone?" "Now everybody's involved." "I followed the instructions exactly," Malcolm replied. Patrick didn't answer. He placed his hand near his waist, not withdrawing it, but enough to apply pressure. The walkie-talkie crackled. "Vehicle is registered to Malcolm R. Hargree. No wants, no flags." Patrick frowned. "That doesn't clear you." The words came out instantly, without thinking. "People drive cars that aren't theirs all the time." "That's not what you just heard," Malcolm said, his voice still and even. Patrick turned sharply. "Do not tell me how to do my job." At this moment, the confidence in Patrick's voice had changed. It was no longer sharp. It carried a defensive undertone. He got the answer he needed, but it didn't match his initial assumption. And instead of correcting the situation, Patrick chose a more dangerous path, denying the truth. Another patrol car drove slowly past the gas station entrance. The officer inside glanced at the situation, then continued on his way. Patrick realized that, but it didn't help him. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." Patrick Noy Lon Hone. "If you just cooperate." "I am cooperating," Malcolm replied. Patrick stepped into Malcolm's line of sight, standing closer. "Then stop questioning me." Malcolm nodded once. He said nothing more. At that moment, everyone understood. Patrick was no longer seeking the truth. He was trying to protect his ego and power, and that was pushing him closer to an irreversible mistake. Patrick stood still for a few seconds, his eyes fixed on the wallet Malcolm was held loosely in his hand. It was an old leather wallet, its edges worn, nothing remarkable about it. "What's that?" Patrick asked. "My wallet." Patrick tilted his head. "Open it." Malcolm followed suit. No rush, no hesitation. When the wallet was opened, Patrick opened inside quickly, almost reflexively. His gaze lingered for less than a second, then moved away. "That doesn't matter," Patrick said immediately. Malcolm didn't react. He just stared straight at Patrick, in silence. Patrick took a step back. Then he stepped forward again. "Give me the wallet again." This time, his voice was different. It was no longer sharp, no longer firm. Malcolm handed over his wallet. Patrick opened it more slowly, more carefully. He looked at each card. He paused. Then he paused again at the same spot. Body cam captures a rare moment of quiet. Patrick read it. Then he read it again. His jaw tightened. His shoulders slumped slightly, almost imperceptible. But there it was. "This yours?" Patrick asked. "Yes." Patrick flipped the card over, checked it, then looked up. "You want to explain this?" "It's self-explanatory." The atmosphere changed right then. Patrick looked around the parking lot, the phones, the eyes. He closed his wallet halfway, then opened it again, as if hoping he had misread the contents. Yvette Calderon was the first to realize. She tilted her head, observing Patrick's expression. "Are you okay, officer?" she asked. Patrick didn't answer. He took 2 steps back. For the first time since the approach began, distance was created. Patrick raised his hand to the walkie-talkie, then lower it. "Why didn't you tell me about this earlier?" he asked, his voice lower. Malcolm looked straight ahead. "You didn't ask." Patrick frowned. "I asked what you did for a living, and I answered." Patrick looked down at the ground for a second. Then he turned away. At this point, he was no longer just facing Malcolm. He was facing the evidence, the cameras, and the fact that he himself had pushed the situation too far. Patrick took a deep breath. "You understand why this is a problem, right?" "For who?" Malcolm asked. Patrick didn't answer immediately. Because for the first time that night, he wasn't sure he was in control anymore, and he knew it. Patrick stood still for a few seconds. No orders, no questions. That hadn't happened since he'd gotten out of the patrol car that night. "Turn toward me," Patrick said finally. Slow. His voice was no longer harsh. It carried a calculating tone. Malcolm turned as instructed. Each movement was clear, familiar, and unwavering. Patrick watched intently, but the previous tension had vanished. It was replaced by something else. Apprehension. "Give me the wallet again," Patrick said. Malcolm handed it over. Without comment, Patrick opened the wallet again, this time without haste. He examined each card, as if reviewing his own decision. The body camera recorded his breathing. Slow. Heavy. Patrick glanced around. More people had stopped. No one turned their back. He raised the radio, paused, then lowered it again. No call was made. "You could have avoided all this," Patrick said, his voice low. "So, could you?" Malcolm replied. The answer wasn't defiant. It was simply the truth. Patrick took half a step away. For the first time, he avoided Malcolm's gaze. Another patrol car appeared at the gas station entrance. No siren. No lights. It stopped, engine still running. The officer inside observed the situation, then looked at Patrick. Patrick realized. His shoulders tensed. He knew. This approach was no longer his alone. Patrick adjusted his posture, trying to regain his composure, but it was no longer effective. The people around had seen enough. The cameras had recorded enough. And before Patrick could say anything more, the door of the second patrol car opened. A figure stepped out, a higher rank, a deep, clear voice. "What do we have here?" In that moment, everything was no longer in Patrick Hollis's hands. Sergeant Nolan Vickers stepped out of his patrol car, his eyes scanning the entire parking lot. He wasn't in a hurry. He didn't raise his voice. A single glance was enough to understand what was happening. The people stopped. The phones were recording. Patrick Hollis stood beside Malcolm, his posture tense. "What do we have?" Vickers asked. Patrick immediately straightened up. "Suspicious individual," he said. "I conducted a stop." Vickers turned to Malcolm. "Sir, are you being detained?" Patrick answered before Malcolm could open his mouth. He was. Vickers tilted his head. "Was?" Patrick swallowed hard. "I'm still sorting it out." Vickers held out his hand. "Let me see what you've got." Patrick hesitated for a very brief moment. Then he handed over his wallet. Vickers opened it. His gaze stopped exactly where Patrick had stopped. A subtle reaction, but enough. Vickers looked up. Is this accurate? Yes, Sergeant, Malcolm replied. Vickers folded his wallet and handed it back immediately. No further questions needed. He turned to Patrick, stepped aside, out of the crowd's line of sight but not far enough for the body cameras to capture. You didn't call this in, Vickers said. I didn't think. You detained him without cause, Vickers interrupted. You ran the car, you got nothing, and you kept pushing. Patrick glanced at Malcolm. He didn't disclose. Vickers shook his head. That's not his obligation. It's yours. Patrick remained silent. Vickers continued, his voice not loud but firm. You're escalating a clean stop in front of witnesses. Patrick took a deep breath. I was being cautious. You were being reckless. The words fell, concise and cold. Vickers stood still for a second. Clear this. Now. Patrick nodded. Yes, Sergeant. They turned back toward Malcolm. This time, Patrick was no longer standing close, no longer occupying space. He stopped a few steps away, his voice lower, slower. Sir, Patrick said, you are free to go. Malcolm didn't move immediately. Am I being cited? No. Am I being detained? No. Malcolm nodded once. Behind them, several people lowered their phones. Others remained standing, until they were certain the conversation was truly over. And for Patrick Hollis, this was only the beginning of the consequences. Malcolm stood there for another second, as if to make sure all orders had truly ended. No more requests were made. No more questions hung in the air. He walked toward the car, slowly, holding his breath. Each step was deliberate, not out of fear, but out of habit of preventing the situation from escalating again. Sergeant Vickers stepped aside, creating a clear space. No one was in his way. Before Malcolm opened the car door, Vickers spoke, his voice low. I apologize for the inconvenience. Malcolm turned his head. It wasn't an inconvenience. Not harsh, not reproachful, just a truth stated by its name. Vickers nodded. I understand. Malcolm got into the car and closed the door. The engine started. The taillights switched on. The pickup truck left the gas station, merging into the dark road. No honking, no looking back. Patrick Hollis stood beside the pump, arms hanging loosely at his sides. No orders, no one to control. The people around began to disperse. A few returned to their pumps. Others lingered a little longer, until they were sure everything was truly over. Patrick said nothing. The body camera continued recording. Vickers turned to him. We're going to have a conversation back at the station. Patrick nodded. Yes, Sergeant. No objection. No explanation. When Vickers got into his car, Patrick remained for a few more seconds. Alone, between the station lights and the lingering silence. No more crowd. No more power to assert. Only one officer remained, standing before a place where everything had slipped out of his grasp, and unaware that the video he had just recorded would haunt him for the rest of his career. Patrick Hollis finished his night shift in silence. No detailed report. No detention record. In his end-of-shift log, he wrote only a short line. Field interview. No incident. No case number. No escalation description. No reason for detention. Patrick knew how to write lines like that. He had done it before. But there was one thing beyond his control. The body cam. When the shift ended, the data was uploaded to the automated system. Time, location, duration of interaction. Before noon the next day, the footage was flagged. Internal Affairs opened a preliminary review before Patrick could even think of an explanation. Not because someone complained, not because of the press, simply because the duration, tone, and chain of commands were unfounded. Patrick was called into a small room at the end of the hallway. A supervisor closed the door. Footage from last night is under review. Patrick didn't ask why. He didn't object. He just nodded. I understand. By the end of the week, Patrick was placed on administrative leave, removed from patrol duty. Hit weapons and badges were temporarily confiscated. The police department's statement was brief. An interaction is under review. The officer involved has been removed from duty pending investigation. No name. No details yet, but it was only a matter of time. Because that video needed no explanation. It spoke for itself. Less than 48 hours after Internal Affairs opened the case, the body cam footage began appearing outside the internal system. No commentary, no editing, no background music, just the raw images and sounds, unjustified commands, ignored answers. The moment Patrick says, "That doesn't matter," that segment was replayed the most. Veterans groups shared the video first. They recognized it immediately. The posture, the breathing, the restraint. Then came civil rights organizations. Then regional media. Then the nation. Patrick Hollis was called in for a formal interview. He said he acted on professional instinct. That Malcolm's attitude worried him. That the crowd and being filmed created pressure. The investigators didn't argue. They just compared. No reasonable suspicion. No reason for detention. Escalation. After a clean verification. Violation of field interview procedures. And another crucial detail, this wasn't the first time. A previous complaint, recorded and then closed, now became part of a pattern. 3 days later, Patrick was summoned to see the commander. A brief meeting, no negotiation. The badge was revoked. The weapons were handed over. System access was disabled as soon as he left the room. A second statement was issued. Officer Patrick Hollis is no longer employed by the department. No photo, no statement. Malcolm R. Hargree did not appear before the press. He continued to go to work, continued his life. When asked, he only sent a short written statement. "I cooperated fully and maintained respect throughout the interaction. No one should be treated like that just because they exist in public. I am grateful that the footage speaks the truth." He didn't mention the medals. He didn't mention his military past. Others did that for him. The video was incorporated into training sessions, used as an example of how power crumbles when it's used to oppress instead of serve. Months later, Malcolm drove past that gas station. He didn't stop. He didn't slow down. He didn't need to. Because the moment there had done what it needed to do. If this story makes you uncomfortable, it's intentional. Please share. Please follow. Because out there are still many similar moments. The only difference is, the camera isn't always on.